I raised a fuss after a class discussion about the Holocaust ended with my son being bullied. My son has always been proud of his Polish heritage. We are Polish Americans, and we've taught him a lot about our family's history. His great-grandfather fought in the Armia Krajowa, which was one of the largest underground resistance movements in Nazi-occupied Europe. He was wounded during the Warsaw Uprising, an effort in which thousands of Polish civilians and soldiers rose up against the Nazis. Unfortunately, he was eventually captured by the Nazis and sent to KZ Stutthof, a concentration camp. Despite the unimaginable horrors there, he survived and later came to the US to rebuild his life, though he never forgot what he had fought for. Recently, my son's class had a lesson about World War II and the Holocaust. After school, he came home unusually quiet. When I asked him what was wrong, he told me that the teacher said Poland helped the Nazis carry out the Holocaust. Apparently, the teacher claimed that Poles were active collaborators and shared the blame for the genocide. My son was horrified, and so was I. He told me that after the lesson, a boy turned to him and said, "I guess that makes you a Nazi sympathizer." Other kids laughed. My son was devastated and just broke down in tears. How can someone say that? Poland was one of the first countries invaded by Nazi Germany, and over 6 million Polish citizens died, half of them Jews. The Nazis considered Poles subhuman and executed entire villages in retaliation for resistance efforts. And yet, even under the threat of death, many Poles risked their lives to save Jewish families. The Zagota Council was established solely to help Jews, and people like Irina Sendler smuggled over 2,000 Jewish children to safety. I sent the teacher an email, assuming there had been some misunderstanding, but instead of acknowledging the issue, she doubled down, saying it was important to explore all perspectives and that Poland wasn't entirely innocent. I was furious. Spreading falsehoods like that not only distorts history but also fuels anti-Semitism and hate. It also disrespects people like my great-grandfather, who risked their lives to fight the Nazis and endured unimaginable suffering in KZ Stutthof. The next day, I went to the school office and asked for a meeting with the principal. I admit I wasn't calm and could have handled it better, and that's probably where I was a jerk, yelling and insulting staff who had nothing to do with it. But I told them how offensive it was to teach blatantly false information, especially when it led to my son being bullied. I brought up historical facts, including how the Armia Krajowa fought against both the Nazis and the Soviets, and how Polish resistance fighters were often tortured and executed. Teacher was also present, and instead of apologizing, she accused me of exaggerating and claimed I was spreading nationalist propaganda. I reminded her that Yad Vashem honors over 7,000 Polish citizens as righteous among the nations for risking their lives to save Jews more than any other country. Now my wife says that I made a scene and embarrassed the teacher, myself, and our son, and overall disagrees with what I did. My son is still being called names, even though the school promised to investigate. My wife thinks I should have handled it differently and not made a spectacle or given it so much importance, but my sister supports my actions. My son has started avoiding speaking in class. He says he no longer feels comfortable sharing anything about his family or roots. I encourage him to stay proud, to understand that what his great-grandfather stood for is much bigger than any mockery or ignorance. But I know that doesn't erase the pain. He started having trouble sleeping, and the other day he refused to go to school. His history teacher hasn't touched the subject again in class, but there's been no public apology or correction either. The atmosphere remains tense. Yesterday, when I picked him up from school, he said something that broke me inside. "Dad, do you think Great-Grandpa would be disappointed in me?" It was hard not to cry in front of him. I assured him that his great-grandfather would be proud of him, that courage also means holding on to the truth when others choose silence. That night, I went back to read the letters my grandfather left, the few he managed to save before emigrating. In one of them, he describes how he survived by pretending to be dead for an entire day among corpses so he wouldn't be executed. That letter, wrinkled and written with trembling hands, reminded me why we cannot allow history to be distorted. Today I started writing an essay, not just for the school but to send to a local newspaper. Maybe I'll publish it online too. It's a defense of Polish history during the war, a response to misinformation, a way to honor those who fought and died without ever being named. And it's also a letter to my son, so he knows there is value in resisting, even if it makes him feel alone for now. I sent my essay to the local paper with some uncertainty. I didn't know if they'd publish it or ignore it, but I felt I had to do it. It wasn't just a personal defense, it was a way to plant a seed of truth amid so many misinformed voices. To my surprise, 3 days later I received an email from the editor. He thanked me for the piece and asked for permission to share it in the opinion section. The next day, it appeared in the Sunday edition under the title, "When History is Forgotten, Ignorance Prevails." The reactions came quickly. Some people wrote letters of support, especially descendants of European immigrants who also felt their past had been misrepresented. Others, however, sent hate-filled messages, accusing me of trying to rewrite history or minimize collective responsibility. It was hard not to let those comments get to me, but I focused on the positive messages. One of them came from an elderly man who told me his mother had been saved by a Polish family during the war. He thanked me for remembering those acts of bravery. At home, however, things remained tense. My wife wasn't thrilled about the publication. While she wasn't against what I had written, she believed that with every action I took, I increased the pressure on our son. She insisted that we should focus on protecting him and not fighting historical battles. I understood her point, but it was impossible for me to ignore what was happening. This wasn't just an academic mistake. It was a distortion that was emotionally affecting our son and his identity. One afternoon, I received a call from the school principal. He invited me to a more formal meeting with the school board. He said that due to the media attention, the district wanted to discuss the content of the original lesson and how to address sensitive topics in the classroom. I thought there might finally be some rectification. I brought documents, newspaper clippings, book excerpts, and even official testimonies. I spent hours preparing. The meeting was long and tense. The teacher repeated that she never intended to offend but showed no signs of remorse. One of the board members suggested that history should be taught with more context and care, and that perhaps what happened revealed the need to review the curriculum. However, others defended academic freedom and criticized what they called an emotional overreaction. As I left, I felt confused. It hadn't been a victory, but it wasn't a complete loss either. That week, my son continued to face stares, whispers, even stifled laughter. One day, he told me another student left a note in his locker that read, "Was your grandpa a Nazi too?" It was hard to contain my anger. We went to the school psychologist, who offered support sessions. My son, although initially hesitant, eventually accepted. There, for the first time, he expressed feeling betrayed by his classmates and also by the adults who did nothing to stop the comments. One night, while we were having dinner, my sister called me. She said her daughter, who goes to a different school, had also had a lesson on World War II. Her teacher presented a balanced view of Poland's role, mentioning both the tragedies and the acts of heroism. My niece felt proud of her heritage and excitedly shared what she had learned. My sister told it as a hopeful anecdote, a small sign that not everything was lost. I decided then to contact that teacher. I wrote to thank her for her approach and asked for recommendations for materials I could share with my son's school. She replied warmly, listing several academic resources, Polish authors, and historical films that accurately portrayed what people experienced during the Nazi occupation. I gathered all that information and prepared a proposal for the school administration, a talk with guest historians, and a commemorative exhibition that included real testimonies. I didn't know if they would accept it, but I had to try. To my surprise, one of the school board members showed interest. He told me that while it had to be approved by the educational committee, they considered that a well-organized extracurricular activity could enrich students' understanding. I got in touch with a Polish-American cultural organization which was enthusiastic about supporting the initiative. When my son found out, he asked me if he had to speak in public. I told him no, only if he wanted to. After thinking about it for a few days, he said he did want to say something, but he needed help writing it. That night, we sat down together. He wrote about his great-grandfather, about what he had been told at school, and how it made him doubt himself. Then he wrote about how his great-grandfather's letters, our family stories, and the books we read together helped him see clearly who he was. I couldn't help but get emotional as I listened to him read it aloud. His voice trembled at first, but then it grew firm. The exhibition doesn't have a confirmed date yet, but just planning it has brought us together as a family. Even my wife, although still worried about the repercussions, has begun to understand why this matters. She confessed to me that she had read the essay several times, and although she didn't say it directly, I saw something different in her eyes. Maybe respect, maybe pride, maybe both. In the school hallways, there is still silence. but also now and then a different look. A student who used to laugh now says hello. Another asked if his great-grandfather really survived a concentration camp. These are small gestures, but they mean a lot. Change is slow, sometimes almost imperceptible, but it's happening. The following week brought a mix of hope and anxiety. As we prepared the logistical details for the school exhibition, I began to notice a transformation in my son. It wasn't sudden, but it was steady. He started showing more willingness to speak, more confidence in his words, although he still carried a shadow of caution. It was during a conversation with one of his literature teachers that he felt inspired to include a poetic fragment in his speech. We decided to work on it together, reviewing verses by Polish writers who explored themes of resistance, identity, and lost at the same time. Tensions with some parents began to emerge. Apparently, several complained to the administration, claiming that the event was too political. One mother sent an open letter stating that we were instrumentalizing historical pain to provoke unnecessary guilt among the children. It was unsettling but not unexpected. In times where history is fragmented by narratives, any attempt at deeper exploration is seen as a threat. Nevertheless, the school moved forward. The use of the auditorium was authorized for a special presentation involving some teachers, cultural representatives, and interested students. My son and I spent several afternoons preparing his part. Amid his fears, he began to feel a new kind of commitment. He told me he wanted those listening to understand that his great-grandfather's story wasn't an excuse or a shield, but a legacy of responsibility. Meanwhile, I sought support from the community. A local library agreed to lend archival materials, and a Holocaust survivor and acquaintance of a friend agreed to give a video testimony we would project during the exhibition. His message was clear. Historical truth must be handled delicately, and heroes don't always wear uniforms. By sharing his experience, he also acknowledged the role of those who, though not Jewish, also suffered, resisted, and died under the Nazi regime. At home, the atmosphere began to shift. My wife, though still concerned about social implications, got involved in the visual preparation of the event. She has a good eye for design, so I left her in charge of the informational panels. It was interesting to see her rediscovering part of the family's history through letters, photographs, and oral stories. One day, while arranging a framed picture of the great-grandfather, she stared at his face for several minutes. Then, without saying a word, she continued working. A couple of days before the exhibition, the school organized an informational meeting for parents. Some came with doubts, others out of simple curiosity. I presented the event's goals, clarifying that it wasn't about imposing a viewpoint but about opening a space for understanding and reflection. The atmosphere was tense but respectful. A father who had previously been critical thanked me for including a variety of testimonies and for giving students a voice in the process. The morning of the event, my son was nervous. He barely ate breakfast. He reviewed his text over and over. He asked me to listen to him rehearse one more time, even though he practically knew it by heart. When the moment came, the auditorium was fuller than we expected. Students, teachers, parents, even some community members who had read the newspaper article. The lights dimmed, and the recorded testimony began. The silence in the room was thick, attentive. Then came the presentations, one by one. Finally, my son took the stage. His voice trembled at first, but he soon found his rhythm. He told the story of his great-grandfather, spoke about the pain of being unfairly targeted, the confusion of being mocked, and the process of reclaiming dignity through memory. He closed his speech with a fragment from a letter we had found together, in which his great-grandfather wrote, "I survived not by luck, but because others believed I was worth saving." The silence turned into applause. Long, deep. They weren't for me, not even for my son. They were for something much greater, for the recognition of a long-ignored truth. After the event, several students approached him. Some apologized. Others just wanted to know more. A boy, who apparently had been one of those who laughed at him weeks ago, handed him a small folded note that read, "Thank you for telling your story. You made me think." That night, when we got home, my son smiled in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. It wasn't a smile of relief, but of certainty. However, not everything was harmonious. The next day, some parents began sending emails questioning why so much attention had been given to a family story. One even suggested that the event had been a strategy to play the victim. I received an anonymous message saying I should stop promoting a country that also has its own stains. Although these comments affected me, I also understood that being part of an honest conversation means exposing oneself. That night, while we were organizing the materials used in the exhibition, I found a small notebook that had belonged to my grandfather. Among its pages were doodles in Polish mixed with English words, notes about work, grocery lists, and on a loose sheet, a thought written in pencil. When men forget, silence becomes betrayal. I showed it to my son, and he copied it onto a sheet he taped next to his bed. For now, we continue walking this path, still unsure of what long-term consequences it will bring. But something has been ignited, and I don't intend to let it fade. In the midst of confusion, misunderstanding, and challenges, we've found a deeper purpose: to keep history alive so it won't be repeated, so it's never distorted, and so that our children, all of them, have the right to feel proud of who they are and where they come from. As the weeks went by, the echo of the exhibition continued to resonate in different spaces. Although most responses were positive, the atmosphere never fully calmed. In the school hallways, some students remained respectful, while others seemed more interested in provoking than understanding. My son, although stronger than before, stayed alert, as if expecting to be targeted again at any moment. The event had left a mark, and although the pain was no longer as sharp, its presence was still noticeable in small gestures, sidelong glances, prolonged silences. In an attempt to channel that tension, I proposed to the school the development of a monthly conversation series on historical memory. The idea was to invite survivors, scholars, descendants, and other students to talk about their own family histories. I wanted my son not to be an exception but part of a network of diverse stories. The principal, perhaps motivated by the impact of the previous activity, accepted the proposal and assigned me the support of a couple of teachers who believed in the initiative. One of the first to accept the invitation was a university professor specializing in Eastern Europe. During his talk, he discussed the complexities of Poland's role during World War II, the myths perpetuated after the conflict, and the narratives that were politicized in different eras. His approach was sober and nuanced. He emphasized that talking about history does not mean idealizing any group, but analyzing facts with rigor and humanity. The audience listened attentively. At the end, several students approached to thank him for opening their eyes to a topic they knew almost nothing about. That same night, during dinner, my son commented that one of the classmates who had previously called him a Nazi sympathizer apologized. It wasn't a long or overly emotional apology, but it was sincere. He said he hadn't understood anything the teacher had said at the time and that, now that he had listened to the experts, he realized he had acted out of ignorance. It was a gesture we didn't expect. My son simply nodded and replied that what mattered was learning. Later he told me that although he wouldn't forget, those kinds of things helped him feel less alone. Meanwhile, my sister put me in touch with an organization that works with young descendants of survivors and fighters from various countries. We exchanged emails, and after sharing our story, they invited us to collaborate on a digital project where students narrated their family memories through videos, texts, and photos. I showed the proposal to my son, and although he was hesitant at first, he eventually agreed to participate. He sat down to write a script with a seriousness I had rarely seen in him. We recorded it in our living room, with his great-grandfather's letters and medals carefully placed beside him. It was emotional to see him express himself with such conviction. The video was published weeks later and received comments from different parts of the country, some expressing gratitude, others sharing similar stories. Nevertheless, outside our home, obstacles continued to appear. We received an anonymous letter in our mailbox. It wasn't a direct threat, but it contained phrases filled with prejudice and rejection. My wife, visibly worried, suggested installing a camera at the entrance. Although I tried to reassure her, I knew her fear was valid. The family history we were trying to defend had become, unintentionally, a symbol that made some people uncomfortable. During a meeting with the Parents' Committee, a man suggested limiting students' participation in events that addressed international conflicts. His argument was that such sensitive topics could be misinterpreted and create division. I raised my hand, heart pounding, and responded that silencing personal experiences out of fear of making others uncomfortable only perpetuates ignorance. Some nodded, others remained silent. Committee president decided to postpone the discussion, but it was clear to me that certain sectors wanted to stop what we had started. School, the teaching staff proposed working on a new curriculum for the World History course. The idea was to include more voices, more regions, and not limit it to traditional narratives. I was invited to one of the curriculum design sessions, along with other parents and teachers. It was an intense experience. Some educators expressed concerns about balancing depth with neutrality. Others argued that teaching history without causing discomfort is impossible. We agreed that each unit would include annexes with alternative perspectives, and that students could choose final projects based on their interests. It was a small but meaningful step. In the midst of all this, my son began to take an interest in learning Polish. He said he wanted to be able to read his great-grandfather's letters without translation. We enrolled in an online course together. The first lessons were difficult, but his enthusiasm didn't wane. One afternoon, I found him practicing in front of the mirror one of the phrases his great-grandfather often wrote, "Nigdy wiść sissy," never again silence. His voice trembled, but there was firm determination in it. He also decided to learn more about other forgotten heroes. One day he came home excited, saying he had discovered the story of Witold Pilecki, an officer who voluntarily infiltrated Auschwitz to organize resistance from within. He spent days researching, reading articles, watching documentaries. He asked me to help him prepare a presentation for his class. He wanted to show that there were people who, no matter the risk, chose not to give in to horror. In parallel, I contacted a small museum in a nearby city dedicated to the memory of European migrants. I proposed organizing a school visit and sharing my son's testimony as part of the tour. They gladly accepted. I coordinated with the school to get permission to take a small group, and several students signed up. During the visit, they saw objects brought by displaced families: clothing, books, utensils, documents. At the end, my son read his testimony. One of the visitors, an older woman, approached him with tears in her eyes. She told him her grandfather had been one of the many forced laborers in the German camps and had lost several siblings during the war. She thanked him for not letting history be forgotten. That night, when we got home, my son told me that for the first time in months, he felt useful. That maybe everything that had happened wasn't just suffering, but also an opportunity. I told him that honoring memory is a form of resistance, and that his voice, young as it may be, was already making a difference. I didn't promise him that everything would get easier, but I did assure him he wouldn't walk alone. The school year was drawing to a close, and with it, the whirlwind of emotions, challenges, and lessons we had faced as a family. Everything that had begun with an unfortunate phrase in a history lesson had become, without us realizing it at first, a deep process of reconstruction, identity, and memory. My son was no longer the withdrawn boy who came home in silence that afternoon, and I was no longer the same father who felt frustrated and powerless. The final activity of the school year was a cultural fair in which each student was to present a meaningful aspect of their family heritage. It wasn't mandatory, but my son decided to participate. He said that this time he wanted to do it on his own, without help. For days I saw him working with determination, searching for details he had previously overlooked. He scanned documents, built a timeline, and even asked for permission to show fragments of the video we had recorded months earlier. When the day arrived, the school gymnasium was transformed into a mosaic of colors, flavors, and stories. There were booths from Italian, Korean, Mexican, Ethiopian families, and also one with a large sign that read, "Polska, a memory of courage and pain." My son wore a white shirt with a small red poppy pin, a symbol of respect for the fallen. On his table were photographs, translated excerpts of letters, a replica of the Armia Krajowa insignia, and a brochure he designed himself titled, "My Great-Grandfather's Story, Courage in Dark Times." Parents, students, and teachers came by. Some asked questions, others simply stood in silence. The most moving moment was seeing several classmates, including some who had previously bullied him, attentively reading each panel. One of them shook his hand and said, "Thanks for not giving up." When I finished walking through the room and approached his booth, I noticed his expression had changed. Serious but calm. He was proud but also at peace. That night, when we returned home, we placed everything in a carefully labeled box. Family Archive School Project. We stored it next to other memories we had preserved over generations. That's when my wife, who had observed everything in respectful silence, spoke up. She said she finally understood this wasn't a matter of distant history, but of the present. That seeing our son rebuild his identity with such dignity had given her a new understanding of the value of memory. The three of us embraced without words because in that moment none were needed. Shortly afterward, we received a letter from the principal. He informed us that, thanks to the work led by our son and the support of several families, the school district had approved the inclusion of an optional thematic unit on civil resistance in Europe during World War II. He also mentioned that the school would incorporate more activities focused on cultural diversity and oral history. It was recognition we hadn't expected, but welcomed as a sign that something had changed for the better. As a way to close the chapter, we decided to travel to Poland that summer. It wasn't a tourist trip. It was a symbolic return. We visited Warsaw, toured the Uprising Museum, and laid flowers at the monument to the fallen fighters. Then we went to Gdansk, from where the grandfather had departed for America. Finally, we went to the remains of the Stutthof camp. The silence there was heavy, but it spoke volumes. My son stood still in front of the memorial wall with no tears, just deep reflection. Then he took my hand and said, "Now I understand why he never stopped telling his story. That trip brought closure. Not to erase what we'd lived, but to integrate it. We understood that not all wounds heal the same way, but all deserve to be seen." In our last days in Krakow, we bought a hardcover notebook and began a family journal. Each of us wrote an entry. My son recounted his journey from confusion to understanding. My wife shared her process of empathy. I wrote about silence and its destructive power, but also about the voice that can break it. Back home, life returned to its rhythm. Classes ended. Tensions subsided. The mail no longer brought offensive messages. Friends started visiting again. And most importantly, my son began sleeping peacefully. Not because everything had been solved, but because he no longer carried the burden of someone else's guilt. One Sunday afternoon, while organizing books in the library, I found a loose sheet that had fallen behind a shelf. It was a note my grandfather had written to me when I was 5 years old. It said, "Always remember who you are, not what they say about you, but what you choose to remember and honor." I smiled. I framed it and hung it next to my desk. Today, as I write these lines, I know I will never again allow the story of our people to be trampled. We learned that pride doesn't need to shout, that dignity doesn't require applause, and that truth, even when uncomfortable, always finds its way when spoken with respect and conviction. The story of my son, his great-grandfather, and our family no longer lives only in letters or old photographs. It lives in the voice of a young man who refused to forget, in his decision to speak up when others remained silent, and in his conviction that defending the truth is, sometimes, the bravest act of all.